Okay, once again, everyone has the biographies of these wonderful women, so I won't go through details. Each of them has been working on violence against women for many, many years, and their distinguished careers have been, bridging various aspects of activism and academic and scholarly work. And what I want to say about each of them is just one small thing. Asma Khader was actually the woman who put the issue of honor killing on the map. For that, her country has both triumphed and paid. On the one hand, they think as if people think around the world as if Jordan was the place of honor killing, which really is by no means the case. The thing exists everywhere. She brought the attention to it, which had that negative aspect, but the real positive aspect of it has been that finally something serious has been done about that issue. Asma's career is wide-ranging, from founding human rights organizations, founding Siggy Jordan, which is WLP's partner organization, to being in the cabinet. And I want to say both about Jacqueline from Brazil and Asma, that both of them have served at the highest levels of their government in the cabinets, but at the same time they have been founders of non-governmental organizations and leaders of movements within their countries and within the regions. And this bridging has been extraordinarily powerful and important. And Jacqueline also has had an extraordinary role both in the study of the context and challenges and strategies related to violence, and also about doing practical things to alleviate violence. And Sindi, last but by no means least, is our head of our partner organization, WLP's partner organization in Nigeria, Baobab for Women's Human Rights. And Sindi also is a long-time activist leader, and she has had a tremendous presence on the scene, international scene. She has done a lot in terms of mobilizing women in the region, and also women in Nigeria. One of the most important things that she's doing, and there are a myriad of things, but one of the most important things she's doing is mobilizing young women, especially the university women, through leadership to help alleviate women both in Nigeria and elsewhere. So without much ado, we go to the panelists. First, Asma Khader.
Thank you, Mahnaz. And I want really to congratulate WLP and its partners, ourselves, and everybody, because I think 10 years of activism were able to build a strong and very effective network of partners in more than 20 countries. And as part of this partnership, I feel very proud because in 10 years, many achievements were happened. I'm not saying that it happened only because of our work, but I do believe that without our work, it will never happen. In fact, talking about violence against women, in my opinion, is the heart of women's rights. Without safety, women cannot achieve anything. And with the fear of being victim of violence, the talent and the contribution to the benefit of the family and the community will never happen. And listening as a lawyer to thousands, if not more, women who are suffering from different types of violence, giving me the impression that no one woman escaped 100% from being victim of one kind or another of violence. But of course, the situation 10, 15, 20 years ago was as if we don't have this problem, because it was happening in secrecy, behind doors, behind walls, and women will never complain or seek any help. More than that, women were educated that whatever violence they are victims of is their own fault. They are responsible of what is happening to them. And because of that, they felt as if it is shame if they speak out or seek help. During the last few years, a lot of efforts before Beijing, but in specific, very closely to Beijing, when the Declaration on Violence Against Women was adopted, 1993, and when women's rights as human rights was recognized in the Second International Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. And later on in Beijing, it was one of the major areas of concern. And this gives all those who were really paying attention to this problem a great support and a voice, not only on the international level, but also on the regional and local, national, local levels. But that was just recognizing the issue. There was no tools maybe to work on it. There was lack of legal protection, especially when it comes to private life, family life. And there was also a lack of services like shelters or counseling or health care, specifically for women victims of violence. And the public opinion was not supporting those victims and supporting the efforts to put an end to violence against women. And we can see that since then, with WLP group, before being the WLP, there was this manual, Safe and Secure, on violence against women. And later on, the struggle in many countries started to better legal protection, state responsibility, because it was, especially when it comes to domestic violence. Governments were always saying that it is a very private issue. We should not interfere in these issues. Year after year, the state responsibility became one major issue, and now we can see that there are some laws adopted, and I agree totally with Ms. Milan, when she said that the implementation of these laws and the laws being useful for victims of violence is a very important thing. And we can see also that the resolution 1325, which is trying to involve women, especially in conflict areas and post-conflict areas. And our region is one of the main regions with this situation, should be involved in building peace and in peaceful solutions, and also protection and accountability for those who are really committing not necessarily individual crimes, but sometimes it is mass crimes against women using their bodies and their sexuality and as a war weapon, in fact. And we can see that women in our regions needs to first understand this resolution, how this resolution can work for them. Women in Iraq, women in West Bank, women in and Gaza, women in Afghanistan, women in different parts of our region, need to know about it and to understand it and to find mechanisms and ways for implementation. Because of that, we in Jordan, for example, tried to formulate kind of national committee for the implementation of Resolution 1325. And only after we have this committee, we discovered that, for example, Jordanian women start to be part of the peacekeeping forces. We have Jordanian women in our peacekeeping forces in Sudan, in Bosnia, in other parts of the world. And we are very proud to know that our women are leading other groups from other nationalities in these forces. Also, we have the problem of landmines, as Jordan was part of the areas where many wars exist. Many people were suffered from landmines. And women were also involved in having the training to clean the lands from landmines. Also, we are working now on a plan of action for the implementation of this resolution and the other resolutions that was adopted to combat violence against women. I want to end my speech by saying that it's very important to work first on peace between women and themselves. They need to be proud of being what they are. And this is very important for personal peace, but also the peace and peaceful relation within the family. The lack of power relation is leading to a continuous type of violations and violence against women. So building a peaceful relation based on love and respect of each human rights of the family members is very important. But more importantly, the communities should believe in peace as a tool to solve resolutions and to live together and to obey the rule of law, the law which protect and respect every individual human rights, dignity, and freedoms. And thank you very much.
Next, we go to Sindi.
Okay, good morning all. Greetings from the women of Nigeria on this. Oh, it's not on?
You just have to get it closer to you, I think.
Can you hear me now? Oh, not too well. Okay. Well, I have not gotten past.
It's better now.
Okay. I've not gotten past, even at my great age, the idea that women should be seen and not heard. So I'm still trying. But I'm bringing greetings from the women of Nigeria to all of you on this anniversary of Beijing. And so I won't repeat what has been said because one of the things is that this is universal. Violence against women is universal. And much of what has been said is true for the women of Nigeria as it is for women everywhere. But I'll talk a little bit about what groups in Nigeria are doing to defeat this, this scourge that is violence against women. And one of the things that Baobab for Women's Human Rights, as the hub for the Women's Learning Partnership in Africa, is doing is concentrating a lot on young women, because we believe that there must be succession. We won't always be here, so we need to have a group of powerful feminist young women who are ready to step into the breach and continue the struggle, because 30 years, 50 years of struggling against violence against women, we have not yet arrived where we want to be. And so we cannot leave the stage empty. So we need to work with young women. And that's one of the things that WLP Africa is doing. We work a lot in the universities. The idea that women must submit is very, very forceful in Nigeria, not just because of tradition, but because Nigeria is a very religious, and I'm using religion in quotes, country. And so mature women have internalized this so much that it is almost difficult to get them to not participate in their own oppression in their homes. And so we're focusing on the younger women at the universities, and also men and boys. It is amazing when you speak to a young boy in, let's say, what would be about 5th or 6th grade here in the U.S., how much entitlement he claims as his own simply because he's a boy. And if we don't correct it at that age, by the time he becomes a young man, he will perpetuate what his father or uncles or people in the neighborhood are doing. And so we're tackling men and boys. We train the men who will now train their sons and also train the boys in their communities that violence against women is not a sign of manhood. In effect, what we're doing is redefining masculinity for men and boys. And also dealing with violence, we're trying to build a bridge across the academy and activism, and so we deal a lot with lecturers. Babab does leadership training for people in the universities, and we start with undergraduates and also professors. You'd be surprised that professors who are gender specialists don't know the first thing about gender when it comes to women. No, it's true. I hope that the ones that are here in the audience, you know the difference. But we find that they don't. And so next month, Babab will be doing a WLP Leadership Institute for 30 women from the Academic Staff Union of Universities. And we intend to do that until all the women are trained, and then we will deal with training the men on gender. Because unintentionally, perhaps, they are passing on what their own socialization is to their students. And so we want that to be reversed. And so for the last few years, we've been dealing with 2 universities in the South, and now we're going to the North to deal with universities in the North. We have also been training journalists on how to report incidents of violence against women, because the way they report violence against incidents of violence will determine how the public react to stories of violence. And a lot of it is tabloid form, sensationalism, and so on, and again, victimizing the victim. Instead of now the woman being a survivor of violence, she's further victimized. And so we also embarked on training for them, and now we have a group called Journalists Against Violence Against Women, who have been trained and who are taking the fight forward also. And in terms of dealing with the law, Nigeria signed CEDAW 26 or 28 years ago without reservations, but it's not implemented. And for the last 10 years, we've been trying to get, first of all, the domestic violence bill, the Domestic Violence Act, and to get the implementation of CEDAW. So now we have changed strategies, and we are going state by state. And if we can get 2/3 of the 36 states in Nigeria to implement CEDAW, it will become domesticated and will be a law useful to women. We also think that engaging with gatekeepers, sometimes there are traditional leaders who are vehemently against the idea. In fact, one state representative said that equality between men and women is an abomination. So we are trying to disabuse him of that fact, and we engage with gatekeepers and trying to make strategic alliances within those communities, within the House of Reps and within the traditional rulers, so that they will come on board, because they hold, especially the traditional rulers, have a lot of power. And when women who are in the towns take on board the idea of freedom and the idea that they are human beings and they have rights, they still have to go back to their villages where these gatekeepers are. So unless we engage the gatekeepers, we will not have the kind of comprehensive obedience to the law, if you will, that we require. Because some of the women, some of the women are also afraid that their children, the stigma that is attached to a wayward woman, because if you have become empowered and you want to talk about rights and and freedoms, that makes you a wayward woman, and then your children will not be accepted in the village. And so we work with those village communities and the gatekeepers to pass the message across. I think that some of the ways that we have to go forward, we have to engage young people. Some of us are sitting on boards with no young people on those boards. Or some of us are sitting in organizations and we have internships, but we give the interns busy work instead of giving them substantial work that will help them to make decisions for themselves. And therefore, they walk out of our organizations. And so we must give them meaning. We don't want to become, we're fighting against patriarchy. Let's not do matriarchy in our organizations that will keep the young women whom we want to engage out of our organizations. So I'll leave with that word, and hopefully we'll think about it.
Thank you, Cindy. Jacqueline, please.
Hello. I would like, first of all, to thank WLP for putting together this wonderful session, and to express that I'm very happy to be here at the New School for Social Research. And I thought that instead of going directly into Brazil, I would try to frame and conceptualize a little bit about violence against women. Starting to say that the social perception, as well as the institutional recognition that certain behavior, certain customs, attitudes, laws, values towards women are violent and express social relations permeated by violence is historical. And it depends ultimately upon the gender power relations which predominate in a given society. So each society has a dominant conception of violence against women, which is expressed in laws, in practices. But that does not mean that it is the only conception. It does not mean that it is static. There is room there for change, and there is room for political action. That was bring us here. The structural characteristics of a society, the cultural patterns, political and economic junctures, the dynamic of various actors as government, religious institutions, non-governmental organizations, universities, etc., private sector, the media, they are the players in the political arena. And they have an effect on the definition of violence against women in a given time, in a given society. What I want to say is that this idea of order and disorder, crime and punishment, they are not absolute truth. They are dynamic concepts, and they can change through time. Also, there is frequently a distance between what is perceived as violent. A murder is usually, homicide is usually perceived as a violent act in every society. What is considered as a crime and what is punished as such. There's not a juxtaposition. And this is very clear in the case, for instance, of honor killing. This is very clear in the case of an argument that was used, but fortunately women's political action, it's less and less, and almost not used anymore, but was used in Brazil, which was the argument of the legitimate defense of honor in cases, for instance, of husbands that would murder a wife in suspicion of infidelity, whatever. So what I want to say is that this distance between what a society recognizes as a violent behavior and what a society punishes and criminalizes as such is also political and depends on political action to be both expanded in terms of what is recognized and shorten the distance between crime and punishment. For many centuries throughout the world, violence against women did not exist as a social and political issue because women were, and still is in many places of the world, a second-class citizen. And this second-class citizenship, it's within the family, in the labor market, in an absence from political spheres, less presence in the educational system. Anyway, laws, policies, customs, values, they vary among different settings, but throughout the history of humanity, we have been second-class citizens. Thus, violence against us has been a second-class issue in most societies, taking different emphases. We talk about emphasis here. We all know that violence against women is pervasive, that it takes very different forms, that the visibility is the result of a political struggle, and that this political struggle has, as the main actor, women's movements. And there has been progress. There has been progress. It was mentioned here, the Beijing conference, and women's rights are human rights. I want to go back to 1993, though, to the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, where, due to women's political action and international political action, for the first time, the human rights grammatic included violence against women as a human rights violation. And this meant a paradigmatic shift in the concept of human rights that had always to do with the responsibilities of the state towards the individual, not considering what happened within the walls of the house or between private individuals. So this great major change that led also to Beijing's affirmation that women's rights are human. I mean, we need to affirm that women's rights are human rights. Can you see the absurd of that? It is because the concept of human rights has been built out historically where some categories are less human than others. Because the only prerequisite to be entitled to human rights is belong to the human species. But what we see throughout history is not only women, but due to race, to ethnicity, to many other factors, to poverty, some are more human than others. So finally, yesterday, in 1995, it was said women's rights are human rights. So I just bring these aspects to show how important it is, the coalition, how important it is, the articulation, how important it is, the political action that has contributed to endorse the new concept of violence against women based on the universality, the indivisibility, and the inalienability of the human rights. And we cannot understand these political victories outside of the context of women's rights advocates, both national and internationally. I'm sorry. I will just, I have a few minutes. I want to mention that my organization, CEPIA, has done a study analyzing violence against women in 8 countries: Brazil, China, Egypt, India, Palestine, Russia, South Africa, and the USA. And we have observed how violence against women is at the same time particular and universal. Particular and universal on its manifestations, but also on the responses of the women on the ground. Because we could see that there was some homogeneity on what women's groups were doing. Many of the things that Sindi has just mentioned, she's doing in Nigeria, things that Asma is doing in Jordan, we are doing in Brazil, in different contexts. And it called our attention the fact that one of the main things is collect data, because as violence against women is invisible, it is necessary to make it visible, to collect data, to influence national census bureaus, etc. So I finished saying that we are gathered here today to celebrate Beijing's 15 years, but we are here gathered as part of a work in progress. And I would like to recognize WLP's role in this work in progress, a very important role to put together organizations from throughout the world, to recognize each woman who is not here, who is working on their own country, locally, or doing advocacy work, also to either create new laws, create new spaces, or shorten the distance between discourse and reality. And to say that I am quite worried about what's happening at the UN right now. I am on the Brazilian delegation, and I don't see much progress over there. So there's a lot for us to do outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I must also mention that Jacqueline is the chair of the board of Women's Learning Partnership. And we've had here 3 presentations which have given us a pretty good overview of what's going on in terms of violence globally, and it's somewhat what we're doing, what kinds of strategies we're using, best practices, so to speak. Jacqueline contextualized the situation for us, giving the historical context and also bringing to us the important axes of power and culture. And I think that we would go to Sindi's comment on media to realize that a lot of what we are seeing regarding violence has to do with the sort of a vicious cycle that knowledge is being shared without much participation of women. Women don't get to define, to create knowledge because they don't have the power. And since they don't have the power, the knowledge becomes something that's not their definition of what knowledge should be. And the information that is shared by everyone is not necessarily helpful to the process that we want to bring about. So this circularity, unfortunately, is something that we have broken out of somewhat, but not quite completely. Sindi gave us some very interesting particular experiences and strategies. The redefinition of masculinity, an extremely important thing, and I think that a very significant effort in terms of redefining relationships from the individual to family, community, and upwards. The idea of bridging academic and activism, which actually we're doing right here, right now, is a very significant effort, and of course the role of youth. No one directly mentioned the importance of technology, which also reminds me, if you would turn off your cell phones, it would be great. But don't turn off the Twitter part of it. We like for people to know what we're saying and doing here, but we just don't want to hear it. So technology wasn't mentioned, but that's an extraordinary vehicle that we've all been using, and actually WLP wouldn't even exist without the new technologies because of the amount of interaction and solidarity building that is necessary for this kind of partnership. So these were interesting strategies that was shared by Sindi. And then, of course, Asma talked about the broader concept of conflict resolution. And she, of course, heads the national effort in Jordan for implementation of the 1325 resolution. And it's very significant that all types of groups and power brokers from the grassroots and NGOs to the military and politicians are involved in that process. And it's very significant that we have a woman such as Asma taking such a leading role, in the resolution, which is supposed to guarantee that women have a role in peacekeeping. So it's in itself it's a very important step. So we've had these wonderful presentations. Unfortunately, we have time for dialogue. So please, if you have comments or questions, go ahead. Yes? Could you identify yourself, please? There are two microphones, on two sides.
My name is Susan Raksh. I am originally from Iran, but I'm living in Norway. And my first question is to Mrs. Asma. I lead a project in Palestine through my party in Norway, training of trainers. But one thing was very important I took up with our partners in Palestine about violence against women. Many women in Palestine believe that the violence against women, which is 80% of women in Palestine, had been experienced violence in different form, domestic violence. They believe the reason for their problem is the occupation and Israel. And they believe that if the occupation ends, the violence could end automatically. What do you think about that? And my next question is to Mrs. Afkhami. As a leader as a president of the WLP, now there are a lot of women living abroad, women from South countries, and they experience violence dramatically. Even they are living in countries which criminalized violence against women. But there are huge problems, especially in Europe, as I have experienced on it. Women had been in violence, but they keep it quiet.
Yes.
Do you work with women, migrant women board their countries from South countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Please keep the questions short so that we can hear as many as possible. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for organizing for this panel. I'm Leila Mouri, PhD student in Columbia University. I have a question. Oh, sorry. Okay, I am Leila Mouri, Iranian PhD student in Columbia University. I have a question that Sindi mentioned about the training the next generation of young women to carry on the struggle. My main concern is nowadays in Iran, after the election crisis, a lot of women's activists forced to leave the country. Then it is this concern that there is a gap between this generation of women that were working for the last 30 years and the next generation is growing in the country nowadays, and how we can just keep that this gap do not expand. My concern is that. Thank you.
Can we hear you on this side? And then
yes. My name is Jody Rory. I'm an assistant professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I teach the international human rights courses, obviously with a focus on gender justice. So in the introductory remarks, the keynote speaker spoke about the inclusion, and it was touched upon a bit of men in the argument. Mm-hmm. Recently, Columbia Human Rights Law Review published an article that I wrote with the help of Leila from Jacqueline's organization, CEPIA, about how Brazil has been successful in utilizing CEDAW specifically in criminalizing domestic violence. So my question is very simple. In including men in the discourse, one of the issues is there's not a high rate of recidivism reduction, right? So what is happening, and I was hoping, Jacqueline, you could talk a little bit about this. Instituto Nus works with men in Brazil, but what's happening in Brazil and other countries to address this issue of decreasing recidivism and in connection with the inclusion of men? Increasing the involvement of men, right, and reducing domestic violence or violence against women.
Thank you. We'll take one more, and then we'll get answers, and then go back to more questions.
My name is Mahnaz Rahman. I represent
Foundation. It was shown in Trafalgar Square in Vienna and brought to Washington Square Park 10 containers that had a replica of how women are being kidnapped because families are poor and they sell their children. I mean, we're talking about violence. We're talking about using a resource and marketing people. They'll never grow up and be able to be whole again. Where do we start with something like this?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sabah Al-Asfour, Bahrain Women Association for Human Development. I have 2 points. First of all, thanks for all the inspiring ladies who are here joining us. Number one, I believe, I share you all, that any change should start from the person himself. It cannot be from other way out. One of the ladies who was trained by us, when we asked her, how did you benefit from the training, she said, I could even convince our neighbors to let their daughter have a driving license. So she didn't benefit for herself only, even she started to change her own community. Number two, it's a question. We worked very hard to involve youth in our organization and to be part of us. Now they are losing hope because they see how slow changing in policies is going on, especially in the absence of transparencies in our countries. How can we keep them enthusiastic? Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's have a round of replies quickly, and then please keep them very short, and then we'll get another.
Thank you. In fact, there was a question on rape victims from the first group, and I think, yes, the problem is that many types of violence are based on do the society respect that the body of the woman is her body and not theirs? And do they believe that personal freedoms is something that exists for both men and women equally? Because many of the crimes, such as rape, for example, she is the victim, but she is punished also because she became a victim. Not necessarily by the law, but there are some texts that is punishing a young girl who was raped by forcing her to accept marrying the perpetrator. So he will escape from being punished also. So there are very complicated situations. I do believe, yes, this is a problem. The victims of rape are seen as if they are responsible, as I said in the beginning, and there is a huge work need to be done on the concepts and the raising awareness and cultural aspects to make it clear that she is a victim and she needs to be protected and not to be punished. To go back to the issue of what happened since Beijing to now, I think a lot of things. And I will link it with men involvement. In fact, as a result of inviting men and judges specifically to workshops on honor crimes in Jordan, and the advocacy campaigns and public awareness campaigns and all of this, lead to see that a very important change is happening. For example, we do have a specialized criminal court now, headed by a man, but this man was able to change the whole issue. Before him, and I mean it, before him, most of the sentences were around 1 year imprisonment, 6 months, 3 months. Since he was there, all the judgments and the sentences given in cases of what so-called honor crimes were not less than 10 years imprisonment. Because the text in the law is giving the right to the court to give the minimum sentence, but they are not obliged to. They used to use it to the minimum. By this new generation, new type of men who believe in equality and human rights and justice and all of this, we can see that changes that we struggle for is really exist, and the results are there. Of course, it's not enough, because we cannot guarantee that every person who will be in this post will think the same way. So what we need is to see that there is a legal change to make the minimum sentence is more. For the trafficking issue, absolutely, it's a very severe type of violence against women. And it is increasing because of the materialistic type of relations, running after money. And the need is there to control this issue, first by raising awareness, and second by laws. On national level, we adopted last year in Jordan anti-trafficking law. But it is not enough, because it is a transaction. It is crimes that need some more advanced legal protection. And I agree with the idea of adding this crime as part of the International Criminal Court mandate, because it is really a very serious one. I will stop here.
I'll let Jacqueline, because we have a specific question.
I think that the issue of what has happened from Beijing to now, it's important, because we might feel a sense of defeat, or that it's not worth doing anything, so nothing changes. I'm sure in each of our country, as was said here also by Asma, there's a number of things that have changed. In Brazil, since 1985, we have specialized police stations that attend only victims of domestic violence. And our constitution, which is a new constitution from 1988, recognizes the role of the state in preventing interfamily violations. And now in 2006, we have a new law on violence against women. Even if you did have the so-called universal laws, penal code, civil code in operation, it was understood that in that particular case of violence against women, you needed a specific legislation, which also sets up special courts to attend women victims of violence. So I think there are things that are going, but also it doesn't impede that violence keeps happening. It puts it on another ground. At least you can name it as a crime, and you can try to punish it. And this might be a mechanism, if not to eliminate, at least to restrain. And in the Inter-American region, there is a convention, the Belém do Pará Convention on Violence Against Women. I think I'll stick to this question because the other ones were already answered.
All right. I think we have one of the few gentlemen among us, so we should hear him.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Figgins. I'm a member of Women North Carolina, which has two purposes. One, to bring university students to the CSW, which we've done this year. The second is to convince our senators that there's broad support in North Carolina for them to vote yes to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. My question is a specific one for Ms. Medar Gould. In the Commission on the Status of Women, we have heard this week that one of the difficulties in the Millennium Development Goals is a lack of the gender budget analysis, the disaggregation of data by gender. So I wanted to ask, besides the obvious thing of hiring people and paying them money, how did you achieve this, and how would we describe gender disaggregation in proposing that with any organization with which we're associated or any government with which we're associated?
Thank you.
My name is Ramatu Ahmed. I'm from Ghana, but I now live in the Bronx. In the Bronx, Thank you, sisters, but I'm really concerned about Cindy. How is your safety when you get back home? I was at a meeting yesterday, and one of the ladies from Babao, 2 days ago at the UN, she gave a presentation, and the panelists were told not to take pictures for their own safety. So I'm wondering what your safety will be at the airport. And if at this point in time, those people, the women who are leading us and talking for us, their safety is at stake, what are we doing as women to protect them? And again, as women, do we look at ourselves and wonder whether we are also problems? Do we trigger a situation that will bring along the violence that is meted against us? And can I also suggest that if you could extend the training to the president of Nigeria, the vice president, the first lady, and the second lady? Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Cristina Angelini. I work for AIDOS, Italian Association for Women in Development. I'm a psychotherapist and I mainly work in Middle East, in Palestine, in Jordan for 5 years, in Syria, also in other countries. What I want to underline today is how violence against women is not only, of course, a private matter, but how it should be considered as a public health issue. Because violence against women, especially domestic violence, has huge consequences in terms of health problem. I mean, psychological health, physical health, not only for the victims, but for the children. We know so many studies show us how children raised in domestic violence situation are seriously affected, and how it is the way to continue the violence. The violence is perpetrated through witnessing the violence. We learn violence. I don't think violent men are violent by themselves, by their nature, but they learn violence. So I think this point should be stressed more and more. It's a public health issue, having enormous consequences, also in terms of financial, in financial terms. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I am Victoria Shukri from Palestine, Bethlehem. I'm happy to be here to highlight, to represent myself, to represent the Arab Network RUA in unit work at Arabic region level, try to highlight the issue on women under occupation and poor women and women who live in conflict areas. But excuse me, I want to tell you that as a Palestinian lady, I didn't see myself that I live in armed conflict. I see myself that I live under occupation since 60 or 70 years ago, more than 60 years ago.
Question, please.
Yes. The question is, I think it's not easy to work on domestic violence or violence against women without working on violence against women who live under occupation, because violence they face from occupation daily life is much, much, much huge than the domestic violence. Women who deliver at checkpoints, women who raped at checkpoints, and women who are living in siege in Gaza. On October last month, 45 newborn child with congenital abnormalities because of the phosphor.
Could you please state your question? We have very little time. Okay.
My question again is, what's the vision for those women?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are running out of time, unfortunately, so we just have a short response from each of the panelists, and I hope you'll forgive us, and in the afternoon after lunch we'll take it up again. So very short responses, please, by everyone.
Okay, I will just pick up on the issue of the consequences of violence against women, and that it should be a public issue. I think it is becoming a public issue in many countries in different ways. It is stated in laws. It has a state machinery to attend victims of violence. And it is also the linkage between violence against women and health is being explained and said. Now we know that the victim of a violence, she has long-term effects on her life, and there are some efforts even to contextualize and to measure in terms of difficulty of going to school, of absenteeism from work, of lack of self-esteem of victims of rape. I mean, there has some studies being done, including by the World Bank, and placing both the consequences for the individual life and in long-term development effects. I do think we lack a more, let's say, keen eye towards the family in general and the children and the effects on the children. But something is being done in many countries.
Okay, the gentleman who asked about disaggregated data. In Nigeria, getting any data is a problem. So, but I can talk to him if he's around later a little bit more about that, because really there is none. That has been one of our issues, is that we cannot tell the true status of women in Nigeria, even when the country reports to CEDAW and so on, because there is no gender disaggregated data. So, but we can talk about that. And I don't like to talk about the Nigerian government, madam. Please. I beg. I don't want to talk about the Nigerian government
Unhealthy.
At all. I go in and out of Nigeria very carefully. I'm very careful what I say in Nigeria as well as out of Nigeria. And I have formed I'm great about strategic alliances, and one of my strategic alliances is with the Immigration Department. Thank you.
Yes, yes. First of all, yes, I want to go back, if I may, to the question on democracy that was asked, and I do believe 100% that first, no democracy without women, and no women achievements and progress for the grassroots, on the grassroots level, without being presented and represent women in the parliament. Because I think that as much as we are involved in decision-making strongly for our own rights and for our own vision to the community and to the country, I don't think that we can get any sustainable progress. And the other issue on the circle of violence, of course, there is a circle of violence, and children are affected. And without breaking this circle and stop it at one point, we cannot make sure that the new generation will live free of violence. To go back to our colleague from Palestine and the network Ru'a, I agree with you, my dear, that there is double, triple, even more effect of violence that can any woman living under the occupation or in any military conflict situation, they will be first affected by the violence, direct violence that can happen, but also their own private issues and private suffering and discrimination and violence will be kept as something that they cannot even tackle or talk about it. So I said before that there is a need to work in parallel to stop that, and I think our vision to see that justice and peace exists for every individual country and people, and for Palestine also. So I think in our vision we are looking to see an end to the occupation, and to see that justice and peace is there, but also to see that the struggle for social issues and to free women from discrimination and violence is also being achieved by that time. Thank you.
Well, this has been a fascinating panel, but since the issue of violence is a very negative issue, I wanted to make sure that we end this panel on a positive note, because, again, to remind all of us, when you want to mobilize people, as Martin Luther King did, he didn't say that he said he had a dream. He didn't say he had a nightmare. And so we have a dream, but part of it has come true. Every country except 7 in the world have signed on to CEDAW. We have 104 countries that have laws against harassment and 89 that have legislation against, some sort of legislation against violence against women. A long way remains to be walked and struggled to achieve our goal, but we're not too far from it. And we have the great Mary Robinson here joining us, and I'm sure with her help we'll be there sooner. So thank you, panel.
Thank you.